don't we get started? Good afternoon, everybody. Those of you that don't know me, I'm Rob. I'm one of the co-founders of AIOG, and I'm really excited today to be hosting Dr. Tim Spenser. As you all know, well, some of you know, we've had this career group for almost 2 years now, and we've been looking for somebody who's been in the field of academic writing and editing. So I actually met Dr. Spenser virtually at a Cold Spring Harbor GLIA in Health and Disease event over the summer. And I saw that he was executive editor at JCB, and I thought, oh, that would be really cool if I can get him to come speak with AIOG. So reached out to him, and he's agreed to talk with us today. A little bit about him: he received his PhD from City University of New York in Marie Filbi's lab. His dissertation focused on signaling mechanisms that underlie axonal growth and regeneration following injury. After finishing his PhD, he moved to Columbia University to study molecular markers of postnatal motor neuron maturation. After finishing his postdoc, he moved on to Nature Publishing Group. I'm sure everyone's heard of Nature. And then from there became executive editor for Journal of Cell Biology. And he'll go over the details along the way, but great to have you. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk to people who are interested in careers outside of academia. I know that while some institutes have started talking about these things, there's still a lot of institutes who don't give their students and postdocs any information on what there is beyond working in academia. And even if you love working in academia, it's very difficult to get a faculty position. And I think it's important that graduate programs give their students the sort of some picture of what else is out there and how you might get into it if that's something that would be interesting to you. So I'm going to start with a little bit of just a few slides, probably only about 15 or 20 minutes in total. I like to leave more time for questions, but I think I should be able to share my screen here. Let's try this. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, you're good.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you again to the organizers for having me here. As Rob mentioned, my name is Tim Spenser. I'm the executive editor of Journal of Cell Biology. And so what I'd like to do is take you a little bit through some of the process of what is the publishing model. How do editors do their jobs? What do they do? What are some of the decisions they have to make? And perhaps even sort of finish up with a little bit about, what are the career options available to you? So we're in a period of time where we're facing sort of a scientific information explosion. There are over 490 journals indexed by Clarivate in molecular and cell biology alone right now. PubMed now contains well over 30 million citations. The number of papers published is believed to double just about every 9 years or so. And there's been an explosion of new journals as well, as online-only publishing has become an option, and which lowers overhead and allows more journals to come into existence. Some of them, as we know, are predatory, but even the reasonable ones, or the ones that actually publishing good quality stuff, there's still new ones coming out almost every year. You can look at something like Nature Publishing, and you see that it seems like they've got new journals coming out every single year. And so the number of journals doubles every 15 years or so. So with all of these journals and all of this publishing, there has to be a sort of concomitant increase in the number of people that are assessing the papers that are being sent into these journals, allowing them to publish good quality work. So I would say that journals fall into one of three models for the most part. There's those that employ professional editors only. That is, those whose job is mainly to be an editor. They're no longer working in academia anymore. They're usually not doing research anymore. There's a lot of journals that use this model. Some of the most famous ones are those of the Nature Publishing Group, Science, and the Cell Press journals. There's those journals which use academic editors only, that is, those people who are still practicing academic researchers, but also do editing as sort of a side job, if you will. Journals like eLife have that, although they do have some PhD trained professionals that assist them in that, but the editorial decisions are made by academics, PNAS, and virtually all society journals use academic editors. Then there's a handful of journals, I should say, at least two that I'm aware of, one of which I'm the executive editor of, JCB. We have a hybrid editorial model in that we use both professional and academic editors. And I can talk a little bit about that at the end, about what I think that makes that model so good. But in any case, a question I get a lot when I speak to groups like this, or even when I go to meetings and just talk to trainees, is what is the role of a scientific editor in the publishing process? As you might imagine, we're involved in the manuscript handling and selection process, but what does that actually mean? So just to give you an idea of sort of the core tasks that a scientific editor engages in on a day-to-day basis, of course, the number one that I'm sure everyone recognizes is that we read and evaluate the new incoming manuscripts. Papers submitted to the journal, somebody has to read that paper and sort of evaluate the quality of the work that's in there and how important it is for the field, etc. After you've read that paper, you lead discussions with both the editorial team and, in our case at JCB, with the academic editor to reach an initial decision. Are you going to send this paper out for review, or are you going to editorially reject it? If you do send it out for review, an editor's job is, of course, to choose and assign peer reviewers. And once that paper has gone through peer review, the reviewers send their reports in, then you have to be able to assess the reports, what the reviewers are telling you, synthesize that information together to sort of get a picture for where the reviewers feel, what they feel about this paper, what they feel are the main deficiencies of the paper, what the paper really needs to sort of meet the bar for that journal, and then discuss those reviewer reports with your colleagues and with the academic editor to come to a decision. And so again, that would require you to make a final decision on the paper and perhaps equally importantly, to craft a decision letter to the authors, letting them know what decision you've made, why you've made it, and in the case of when you're, let's say, inviting a revision, what you expect to see in that revision. So that actually takes quite a lot of more work than you might imagine. And also, when we find, even after you've accepted a manuscript for publication, it's the editor's job to go through those final files and make sure everything is in order, make sure the authors have sort of dotted all their I's, crossed all their T's, all the relevant data is there, the figures look good, etc. So to really understand what those tasks are, I thought I would take a little bit of time to go through the editorial process itself. For those of you who have published before, and even if you haven't, if others in your lab have and you've seen how it goes, there's sort of this mysterious process, right? Manuscripts go into some black box, you send it into the journal, and then occasionally papers come out. But what exactly happens in that black box that when you send the paper into the journal to the point where you get your decision back? And so here's a brief outline of basically what can and does happen to a paper that's submitted. So a paper is submitted to the journal. I don't know if you could see my pointer here. It's read by an editor. And so basically the editor will read the paper, will sort of write up a summary, will give their own sort of assessment of whether or not they think it's appropriate for the journal and whether it would be a good candidate for review. That is then discussed amongst our editorial team. Again, each journal does it a little bit different, but let's say I'll give you the example of JCB. We'll discuss it as a team, and then we'll also discuss it with an appropriate academic editor. And let's say we decide that the paper is not appropriate for JCB, then it's returned to the author, and that's what we call an editorial rejection. But if we do decide to send it out for review, we then go ahead and choose reviewers, send out invitations, try to ask them to review the paper. Once we get 3 reviewers, then the paper is out for review, and we wait for the reviewer reports to come back in. Again, once we get those reviewer reports, we read through those reports, we think about them, we discuss them, and we come to a decision. And as you might imagine, there are multiple decisions that can be reached. If the paper is ready for publication, you can accept it, you can invite a revision, you can reject the paper, but perhaps you think the paper has potential, and the revisions that would be necessary to really make the paper appropriate for the journal might take more than your usual revision period, which for many journals is about 3 or 4 months. So you'd really love to see the authors do this, but you understand the realities of doing research, and you say, okay, I'm going to reject this paper right now, but if you are willing to put in all this work and come back to us, we'll be happy to take a look at it again. Or if you think the paper really just is too far away from where it needs to be appropriate for your journal, then you could just reject it outright. And of course, in these two cases, if you ever do see that revision, it would go back through the process again. Generally, in most cases, you would send it out for re-review by the same reviewers, preferably, and come to a final decision at that point. So just some rough statistics to give you an idea of what editors at JCB have to work through. So we get about 100 new papers each month. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's those are just new incoming manuscripts. That doesn't include papers coming back from revision, appeals, other sorts of things, pre-submission inquiries, etc. At JCB, again, these are our numbers. About 70% of submissions are returned without peer review, so we have a pretty high bar. But you know, the ones that we do send out do pretty well, and I'll show you that in a second. But we do editorial reject about 70% of the submissions we receive. And we do that pretty quickly, usually within 3 to 6 days. Of the 30% that are sent out to a reviewer, we typically try to get 3 referees to assess the paper. That's not uncommon. Peer review in our hands tends to take about 3 to 5 weeks, usually on the upper end. We try to speed it up as much as possible. In general, we ask reviewers to return their reports within 2 weeks. That almost never happens, of course, as if any of you have sent a paper peer review, it's extremely unlikely that you'll get a decision back within 2 weeks. But we try to coax the referees along as much as we can. At least at JCB, we invite a revision almost half the time. And of those papers where we have invited a revision, they generally get published. About 97% of those are eventually published. They might have to sometimes go through one other short round of review if there's 1 or 2 things missing in the revision, but for the most part, they eventually get accepted and published. So one of the questions I get a lot as well when I go out to meetings is what exactly are journal editors looking for when they're reading a paper? And again, this is going to vary slightly from journal to journal. It depends on what the journal publishes and what types of papers they're and what their audience is, and what is typical for that particular journal. But using JCB as an example, and I think this actually goes for a lot of different journals. Of course, when we're reading a paper, we're looking at the quality of the data. We're looking to make sure that the experiments are technically sound. We're looking for things, when we're talking about a big picture, we're looking at things in papers that will excite your research community, you know, something that's really going to make your research community sit up and take notice. And because we're a journal that caters to a larger audience, you know, the whole cell biology community, we're also looking for stories that your lab neighbors might want to read, even if they don't work on the same stuff as you. The idea being something that is not just exclusively of interest to your own community, but maybe to some of the ancillary communities that may sort of dabble in some of the things that you work in, things that are of interest to more than just your niche group. And on a more practical level, at a more detailed level, some of the questions we're asking ourselves when we're reading a paper is, what is the conceptual advance of this paper? Does it, for example, settle a long-standing debate in the field, or does it change the way that scientists think about a particular biological question? Of course, we're looking at the strength of the conclusions. Have the authors done enough to reasonably rule out alternative interpretations of their data? And again, so varying from journal to journal, this last part may differ a little bit. Some journals expect more of this and some expect less, but let's say at JCB and some of the top end journals, they're looking to see that you've provided some insight into the mechanisms at play in whatever paradigm you're looking at, demonstrated physiological and or functional relevance of this pathway or what have you. And really the generality of the findings. Is this really specific to this one niche problem that you look at, or is this something that's common to, let's say, many different cell types or many different organisms? Something that's going to be of interest beyond just your core field. So let's say you've got a paper and you're deciding to send it out for peer review. The next step is, as I mentioned, picking peer reviewers. Now, again, if any of you have been through the peer review process, it often feels a little bit like this. But I assure you, the reviewers, for the most part, while it may seem like that very critical reviewer number 3 is out to get you, I assure you that generally isn't the case. They are just interested in having the paper be as solid as it possibly can and make sure that it does answer the question that you've sort of sought out to answer when you started this project. So what we're really looking for is referees who have a technical expertise, as you might imagine, to assess what's in the paper. And as these days, as we have more tools available to us, more molecular, cellular tools, there's an expectation that you use them. And so papers have become very multidisciplinary. And so sometimes you have to be able to have referees from different technical areas to be able to assess different aspects of the paper. You do want to have referees that have a broad knowledge not only of their field, but are also familiar with the scope and caliber of the journal. Different journals have different criteria for what they expect for their papers, and you want a reviewer who knows what your journal publishes and what would be the bar for a paper to appear in that journal. Of course, we want referees that are efficient, and what I mean by that is, provide good actionable feedback and also do it in a relatively timely manner. As I mentioned before, it's almost impossible to get a review within 2 weeks, but getting a review in 3 weeks is more reasonable. Someone who routinely takes 5-6 weeks to return a review to you is somebody who's not someone you're going to continue to use because they are too slow to be able for you to be able to return decisions to authors in a timely manner. Of course, you want people who are going to be fair. That's a bit of somewhat of a subjective term, but we look at what the reviewers are writing and evaluate whether or not we think that they are touching on topics that are important for the main conclusions of the study and not going off on tangents and saying, hey, why don't you do this, this, and this? And so we do try to look for reviewers that are good at sticking to what is important for the paper and not trying to send the authors off on ancillary pathways to sort of just to answer some question that they may have. And obviously, we want people that are going to avoid obvious conflicts of interest. If you're working on a similar story, then you should tell us that, and we'll find someone else to review it. Even if you are trying to be as fair as possible, if you are working on something similar, you are going to be somewhat possibly predisposed to either like that story unduly or be unduly harsh. It could work in both directions, but we're looking for people that will let us know when they have a potential conflict of interest and say, hey, I can't do this because of X, Y, Z. So you send a paper out for review, it comes back, and now you've got 3 review reports in front of you. So in general, like I said, we try to get the paper back to the authors within about 30 days or so, but it's important to remember that you are assessing and synthesizing those reports. You're trying to take the actual arguments that the reviewers are making, and you want to make your decisions based on the strength and the veracity of the reviewer arguments and not simply count votes. Like you've got 2 negative reviewers, 1 positive reviewer, that doesn't necessarily immediately equal a rejection, and vice versa. 2 positive reviewers and 1 negative reviewer doesn't necessarily mean you're going to invite a revision. That negative reviewer might be making some really, really good points that undermine the main conclusions of the paper. So there is an idea that you do have to be able to synthesize reviewer reports, what other people are writing, and sort of process what that means for the paper. And JCB, like a lot of journals, tries to avoid more than 1 round of major revisions. There may be a case where we might offer the authors an ability to do a second revision if it's very minor, but honestly, multiple rounds of major revisions generally doesn't help the authors, doesn't help the editors, doesn't help the reviewers. It can be exhausting. It could lead to what I call reviewer fatigue, where reviewers just don't want to review anymore. And that leaves you in a very bad spot. If you have a revision where the original reviewers don't want to reassess it, bringing someone in new can completely throw a monkey wrench in the whole process, right? Because you've got somebody new with new ideas and new perspectives. And it's important that you try not to move the goalposts, as the saying goes, on the authors. You want it to be a fair and concise process. So if after one major round of revision, the reviewers still think the paper has a long way to go, most journals will just reject it at that point. Even if you can see a kind of a clear path forward, you say, well, if the authors would just do, this experiment, that experiment, and that experiment, they'd probably get there. But if that's something that's going to require another major revision, it isn't in the journal's best interest, and it's definitely also not in the author's best interest, in my opinion. So, sorry. Okay, there we go. So that sort of covers a lot of what the editors do on the day-to-day basis in terms of manuscript handling. But what else do editors do? So we get to commission reviews and perspectives, previews, or as we call them, spotlights, news and views, as the Nature Press calls them. So you get to contact experts in the field and say, hey, would you like to write a review on this topic? We get to come up with the ideas for these topics and pitch them to potential authors and go back and forth with them to sort of think about the best way to phrase this and best way to angle that particular idea to make a review or a perspective that might be of use and interest to the rest of the community. We attend conferences and meetings, or at least we used to pre-COVID, conferences and meetings in a variety of different fields to talk to researchers about what they're working on, see what people in the field find the cool new stories, maybe even invite some work in if there's anything appropriate. And we also do site visits. We visit scientific institutions, talk to researchers, talk to people in their lab about what they're working on, and just sort of gauge their interest in the journal and our interest in their work. We also get to coordinate special projects, sometimes collections, for example, JCB, this is our 65th anniversary, and so all year we've been running these special collections in different areas like mitochondrial biology and adhesion, etc. And we pick some of the top papers from our history that were seminal in those areas and sort of post them as a collection online. We get to do special issues, like collections of reviews and perspectives on one particular topic. Like, for example, earlier this year, we did one on cancer biology, cancer cell biology, and things like that. So those are also some cool things that you get to do as an editor. Depending on the journal you work for, you might get a chance to organize meetings and symposia. At JCB, we do occasionally have these one-day symposia that we run. We're working on one right now. And so that's also a lot of fun too, finding co-organizers, inviting people to give talks, working out all the logistics. That's again, depending on the journal you work for, you might get a chance to do something like that. You get to choose the way the journal looks. You get to choose the cover images. Authors will submit potential cover images and say, hey, how about mine? But you get to choose the one that goes on the cover and think about some of whether or not to put some of those images in your table of contents and feature those heavily in the journal. You also get to, again, depending on the journal, write editorials, sometimes other content, like some journals publish research highlights. You might get to do some of that. And it varies from journal to journal as well. And in some cases, do some developmental editing. At JCB, we don't do that so much for research materials, but for things like reviews and perspectives, we do developmental editing. And for those who don't know what developmental editing is, that's sort of going through the written paper and sort of thinking about, could this be phrased better? Is this clear? Is there a way to write this a little bit differently to give it a better is this easier for someone in the field, someone outside the field, more importantly, to assess? Okay, sorry. And so one of the things that you do here when talking about editors is, you are leaving the bench, right? You're no longer a practicing research scientist when you become a professional editor. But there are a lot of things that you are doing that are still similar to what you were doing when you were a researcher. You are still immersed in that sort of bleeding edge of primary scientific research. And to some degree as an editor, more so, because now you get to see all the cool news stories that are potentially coming out before they're even published. You get to see them before anybody else. You see them in their very infantile stage initially, and then they move forward as they go through review. But you get to have a hand in that. You get to have a hand in the way that a paper moves forward from its initial submission to its final product. And you get to be involved in the process of this new primary scientific research. You still are required to use critical scientific thinking. When you are reading, let's say, reviewer reports, you are assessing the questions that those reviewers are asking, and sort of thinking about what's feasible, what's not feasible, whether or not that is a key question to support the main hypothesis of the paper, things like that you are doing now in your own work. You're now doing that in other people's work as well. You get to do a lot of networking with the scientific community. Researchers always like to talk to editors and get a feel for what they think about their work, or if they're interested in writing a review for you and things like that. You do quite a bit of networking, especially at meetings when it comes to talking to researchers and reviewers and authors. And one thing that is different a little bit from being a researcher is now you get exposure to a broader number and range of topics. When you work for a journal, depending on the journal you work for, you're covering the whole scope of that journal. Like for JCB, papers that I'm reading cover the whole breadth of cell biology. And so you become what I call a scientific generalist. You have to sacrifice that depth of knowledge that you once had as a researcher. As a student, as a postdoc, you know everything about your own little niche field. But now you have to sacrifice that depth of knowledge for a somewhat more superficial but kind of fun breadth of knowledge. You get a big picture view of entire fields. And again, you're no longer an expert in that one thing, but you sort of have a very interesting broad perspective on all of the topics in a given area, like in my case in cell biology. But there are things that do change being an editor. So as I titled this slide, Scientific Editor as Ex-Researcher. Compared to what you're used to as a student and postdoc, deadlines and schedules are comparatively short, right? They're more on the order of days and weeks, occasionally months. We're not talking about a 3-year project. You're not talking about, if you work on rodent models, you're not, thinking about, okay, well, I'm breeding these animals, so they should be born in 20 days, and then I have to use them at P10, so I'm thinking a month in advance. The deadlines tend to be a little bit shorter. And while this is definitely not a 9-to-5 job, it is more 9-to-5-ish than being a student or postdoc, simply because you can, most of your work is being done electronically on a computer. You can do it at your own pace and in your own, the times that suit you. But because the deadlines are shorter, your time-related pressures are often greater. Things have to be out in 3 days, or things have to be out later this week. And so there is a little bit of that. Compared to a lab, the working environment is a little bit more corporate and office-like. You do spend a lot of time in an office, at your desk, just working on a computer. You're no longer, getting up to do your experiments. You're not so sort of splitting that time between writing and then going to do, an experiment that you would do when you were a student or postdoc. And so that does take a little bit getting used to. Although it still is a comfortable scientific workplace. Most of your colleagues are scientists. You still talk a lot of science. It's just you won't be doing as many experiments. And you spend more time on sort of clear communication of individual ideas to a broad audience. As a student and postdoc, you do spend a lot of time talking to your colleagues, whether they be lab mates or others in the field, and you're talking about in detailed perspectives on the problem or the project that you're working on. Whereas as an editor, you're spending more time talking to a broader audience and trying to make really complex ideas clear to a broad audience. So in general, I would say the work-life balance of an editor is a little bit better, but at the cost of persistent deadlines. And what I mean by that is, like I said, the deadlines are a more short time scale and can be sometimes the time-related pressures can be higher. But the other thing is, everything we do is largely electronic, can be done on a computer as long as you have an internet connection. So the great thing about the job is, you can do your job from wherever you are at whatever time you want to, as long as you have an internet connection. The bad part of it is you can do your job whatever time and wherever you are, as long as you have an internet connection. The idea being that is sometimes it does feel like you're never really away from it. Whereas, as a student postdoc, you can, when you go home for the night, you leave the lab, you can, depending on what you're working on, you can sometimes leave that stuff behind and just say, I'll come back tomorrow and take care of it. Whereas as an editor, that stuff sort of always follows you around. And it's not to say that you have to be working 24/7, but there's always that opportunity to do that. And there's always the expectation that you are working on these things, especially when deadlines are impending. So switching gears a little bit, just to talk about how journals select editors. How do you get an editorial job? What are the journals looking for? And again, each journal does this a little bit differently, but these are some of the ideas that most journals will focus on. Of course, they're looking for people with a strong research background. Needless to say, a PhD is a requisite. And in general, most editors will have postdoctoral experience. I've known a few editors that have come straight out of their PhDs, but it is relatively rare. For the most part, editors will come out of their postdoc. Not to say that you have to finish a postdoc, but most of them have done at least 1 or 2 years of postdoctoral work. We're generally looking for people that have broad scientific interests, and if all you can really focus on is your one little area, then being an editor is definitely not for you, because you're going to be expected to cover huge swaths, or in some cases the entire breadth of the journal that you work for. You definitely want to have an interest in science communication, because that's basically what you're doing as an editor. Enthusiasm for the science that you'll be covering and for publishing in general, because it is a new model. It's something that you're not doing as not necessarily thinking about as a researcher, but you really have to spend a lot of time thinking about publishing and how the scientific publishing landscape is changing. We're also looking for people that we think will be a good ambassador for the journal, someone who is comfortable talking to researchers and thinking about ways to to convince those researchers that your journal is a good journal to submit your research to. And also, you do have to have some degree of writing ability. It is not essential that you are a great writer, because while you will be doing a lot of writing as an editor, most of it will not be for publication, for public consumption. It'll be mostly internal things, writing to the other editors, writing to people in production and things like that. But you do have to be able to communicate effectively, because you will be writing decision letters, communicating with reviewers and authors, and being able to communicate in an effective way. And when it comes to decision letters, sometimes in a very polite way. I don't think authors would mind too much if you're very brusque, if you will, in an acceptance letter. But a rejection letter does take a little bit of finesse, because you want to let the authors know that we really appreciate the work. We think it's high quality work, but it's just not right for the journalers. So those sort of communication skills are important. And most journals have what I call the trial by fire. There is this manuscript test that they'll make you take. It's a sort of a stress test, if you will, where you have to read several manuscripts in a very short period of time and be able to assess them and evaluate them. That's something that would come if you applied for a job and you were getting interviewed. So in addition to a scientific editor that I've mentioned, just to sort of give you an idea of what other things are out there at scientific journals, some publishers have review journals, like the Nature publishing journals have like Nature Reviews Neuroscience or Nature Reviews Molecular and Cellular Biology. Those journal editors, those review journals, have a little bit of a different job. They're not really assessing research, right, primary research. They're trying to get a big picture of the field that their journal covers and think, okay, what's a good topic for review? Who can I ask to write this? How can I work with them to get that into the shape of a review that would be of interest to the field? So you spend a lot more time thinking about already published work and really not time on stuff that's yet to be published. Whereas a scientific editor is sort of the reverse. You spend most of your time thinking about stuff that hasn't yet been published and less time on post-published stuff. There's something I call publishing editors. It's not really an official term, but some publishers will hire people PhD trained people to sort of manage multiple, small journals in their group of journals that they publish. And so those types of editors tend not to be sort of directly hands-on with the individual manuscripts. They're more making sure that they're academic editors are getting all the resources and information that they need, and making sure that the journal is covering all the topics that they really need to cover. And sometimes if there's some areas they're not getting a lot of papers in, they'll go out to meetings and try to encourage some more of that work in, but they're not doing so much of the hands-on assessments that professional scientific editors will do. Some journals, some publishers hire specialized editors for like news features and feature sections. These can be PhD trained people who will look at incoming science journalism stories and evaluate them, things like that. Not too many publishers have this, but a few do, including like the Nature Publishing Group and I think Cell Press. So if that's something that's interesting to you, those jobs do exist. Copy editors. So just to be clear, a copy editor is a little bit different than someone who actually just reads through the papers and makes sure the style and language are appropriate for the journal that is publishing it. This position is not necessarily does not require a PhD, though it does require some science background. But I have known at least a couple of PhDs that have gone into copy editing. If you like that sort of thing, great. It's definitely not for me. I prefer reading the science and not sort of nitpicking over the language, but it's definitely an option if that's something you're interested in. And production staff. Again, production staff doesn't always require PhDs, but sometimes they'll hire PhD-trained scientists to oversee some parts of the process. Other career options, if you don't want to go into publishing, but are interested in writing overall or communication of science, is book editing and acquisitions. Medical writers, there's always pharma companies, medical institutes, are always looking for people to do medical writing. And of course, the science journalism. Again, science journalism doesn't necessarily require a PhD, but having a PhD is a big help if you're interested in science journalism. So just sort of finish up a little bit, one other question I get a lot when I do these sorts of career events is, well, okay, so I've got an editorial job. What's the next step? What do I move on to? What are some of the things that I can do from there? So the most obvious is promotion within the journal or company. For example, if you're you're an editor, you can move up to senior editor. If the chief editor position comes open, you might be able to be promoted to that, or you might move up in the company to a more senior level. You can switch journals, sort of one of the things that I did. I was at Nature Neuroscience, and I moved over to Journal of Cell Biology. You can transition to the business arm of the company if you're really interested in the publishing end of things and want to get away from the more nitty-gritty science details. I've definitely known people that have moved into the more business aspects of of companies. You could work with funding agencies. Basically, grant officers and administrators can often are, or at least the grant officers are PhD trained people, that some of them of which come from the editorial fields. So you can work for the NIH, you can work for private charities like Michael J. Fox Foundation or things like that, because they're often looking for people to assess their grants. Freelance science journalism, as I mentioned, I've known one person who was a longtime editor, and then left publishing to become so to write popular science books. That's something that's open to you. People have moved on to pharmaceutical careers, to write for them, to administer for them, things like that. And science policy jobs also. I've known a couple of editors that moved on to science policy jobs at the NIH or at private foundations. And finally, academic administrations jobs that are open to some of these jobs are open to people coming from the editorial fields. So I just want to close with that, and thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer questions. I see a few are coming up. Sorry, that's what my pauses were. I was looking to see if I should answer those questions now or wait to the end, but I figured, given the circumstances, I think it'd be better to wait to the end to answer the questions. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them. And thanks. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm going to read some of the questions that came up in the chat, and some of them you did answer as you went along the way. So I can try to maybe rephrase or ask for additional detail.
Sure.
So the first question, thank you for the presentation. So this one has to do with reviewers. In cases where you do get an unfair reviewer, do you weigh that in making your decision about the manuscript, or do you ask them to tone the reviews down, or like how does that process look like? You said like not necessarily like two good, one bad doesn't mean you'll actually accept. Could you talk a little bit more about the process?
Well, that's so, yeah, I mean, that is a question. It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen sometimes. You'll have one very negative reviewer. Now, you, like I said, you're reading those reports, and one of the most important jobs of the reviewer, I'm sorry, of the editor, is to be able to parse that sort of those reviewer reports. And if you think a reviewer is being unfair or being unduly critical or asking for too much, we routinely overrule reviewers. It's rare for you to say, "I'm just overruling this reviewer entirely," right? Because it's not an all or none scenario. You might have a reviewer that raises like 2 or 3 good points, but like another 2 or 3 that are just way beyond the scope of the study. So, it's your job to sort of to look at that and say, okay, these 3 questions, I can see why the reviewer is asking them. It's interesting, but it's not relevant to this. So you can overrule on those points. If the reviewer is being completely unreasonable, which happens very rarely, but it can occur. I've had it happen before. You can just disregard the entire review. In general, it's our policy not to remove that review. We'll send it to the authors, but we'll say that we think the reviewer doesn't necessarily reflect what our position on the paper is, so we're not going to ask you to address any of their comments. And if the paper comes back in from revision, we'll either just send it to those 2 reviewers, or if there's really some reason why we think we need someone else, a 3rd reviewer, let's say that 3rd reviewer had some expertise that was key to that paper that the other 2 reviewers didn't, we might recruit a 3rd referee in the re-review period, but try to avoid that if at all possible, just because it does sort of put the authors in a bad situation where you have somebody new coming in who hasn't assessed the first version, and they could raise all kinds of new things. And so when we do that, we try to ask them to stick to just the stuff that was added in revision, but it's not a perfect scenario. But yes, in general, that's really what the editor's job is to sort of negotiate the reviewer reports and decide when an author is being unreasonable. And also bear in mind, sometimes an author thinks that, a reviewer is being unreasonable. If an author thinks that a reviewer is being unreasonable, doesn't mean we're necessarily going to agree. We might think that the reviewer's points are good ones. They might not have been phrased in the best way possible, but, you do have to be able to assess whether or not they're valid points.
Great. Another question, you touched on this. What is the minimum level of academic training needed in order to become a scientific editor?
Yeah, the PhD is required for a variety of reasons. One of which is, it's hard to assess whether or not someone has had enough experience in in research and in publishing. Having a PhD generally means you've for the most part published at least 1 paper. There are some exceptions. Some institutes don't necessarily require that, but I think most require that you've published at least 1 paper and you've had experience with the process, and you know what it takes. But it's also about having experience in working in science and understanding what it takes to run a project from start to finish, and understanding the types of questions you can ask and how experiments work. Having experience running these types of experiments, like it's hard to judge a Western blot if you've never run one. So when something goes wrong in a Western blot, the types of things that you're likely to see. So having that experience is really essential. And I think one of the reasons why most editors come with postdoctoral experience is I do think that you do need something of a broader perspective on science. So for the most part, you'll do your PhD and then you move on to a postdoc. And most of us, while you might not switch fields when you go to a postdoc, but you'll go on to something that's not exactly what you were working on before, right? So it gives you a new set of, you're in a sort of a new field or a new subfield. You're thinking about new questions, new ideas, you're learning new techniques. It gives you a broader perspective on both research and on science. And I think that sort of having that background is sort of necessary to really be a good editor. I can say for sure that I don't think I would have made a good editor coming straight out of my PhD. I really feel like I needed that postdoctoral experience and broadening my horizons a little bit before I was ready to be an editor.
Okay. So I guess to follow up on that, so since the PhD is required and some people go on to do the postdoc, how important is your publication record to becoming an editor?
We don't really care where you've published. It's just to see that you've done it, so you have some understanding. We want it to, of course, it should be in a peer-reviewed journal, of course, just to know that you've been through the process and you understand how that works. But the publication, when I am evaluating candidates for a position, I'll look at the CV and see that they have published, but someone who has, 3 first author papers and someone who has 1 first author paper, that doesn't make that much difference to me as long as I've seen that they've been through it. It's really more about, do they have an understanding of what our journal publishes and the subject matter that we'd be interested in, and the types of things that they'd be handling if they were given the job.
Great. So building off of that question, is there anything that you can do as a student or a postdoc? Like what kind of skills and achievements are key for standing a good chance? Is there anything that you can do, like other activities, whether it's like writing a scientific blog or whatever, that can help prepare you and make you stand out as a good candidate?
There are a few things that they can do. I mean, the first one is not to be overly simplistic, but the fact of the matter is the best thing you can do is just read a lot of papers. When I was a student and a postdoc, I wasn't really thinking, oh, I'm going to be an editor. That wasn't my end goal. At the time, I started my PhD, and even when I was starting my postdoc, I was still thinking that I might stay in academia. But one of the things that I did, just because it was something that I like to do, is if I would get the table of contents of journal X that I read all the time, and I'd look through the list of papers and I'd see something that's not really in my field, but oh, that sounds pretty cool, I'd often go and read it. And so I think I had been reading outside of my own little core area more than maybe some of my colleagues. And so that really helps, having a broader perspective of science and the science that you work on is good if you want to be an editor. Writing a blog is certainly good because, like I said, you don't necessarily need to be an excellent writer, but if you're writing a blog, that means you're thinking about scientific topics, right? You're probably talking and writing about things that are not just exclusively in your own little niche field. So again, it's getting you a more broad exposure to other types of science. And so in that sense, it'll definitely help, I think.
Okay. I had a question about JCB itself. How does JCB feel about archive papers, like pre-publishing?
Yeah, I think most journals these days are okay with preprints. Each journal has different rules. JCB, we're pretty lax. It's fun, you can submit it straight from there, and you can even put up your revised version if you feel the need to. Most journals have a rule that you can only put your original version up on bioRxiv or one of the preprint servers, and the sort of any revised version cannot go up there. So if you do want to put it on bioRxiv or what have you, you might want to check with the journal you're submitting to see their specific rules. But as far as I know, virtually all of the main journals that you might be willing to interested to submit to will allow you to post your original manuscript to a preprint server. Now, on a sort of taking a step back, that's sort of just journal rules. But as far as my own particular feeling about preprint papers, I mean, I think it's great to be able to get it out there quickly and have everyone be able to look at it early. My only concern with preprints is that too often I'm seeing them cited in papers and in, as sort of a core foundational citation for a paper, saying this is what we're building this research project is built on this idea, and this idea is supported by, this preprints paper. And again, so you're building your foundation on a paper that hasn't itself been peer reviewed. So that can be a little bit of a problem. So, I don't mind you citing a preprint paper, but it shouldn't be sort of one of those foundational citations for your paper. Also, it's a little, this is neither here nor there. There's not a lot we can do about this, I think, but it is troubling to see how many sort of media stories on science that are based on preprint papers. They'll see something in bioRxiv, and someone will write a news story on it. And again, this hasn't been evaluated, and so I think it leads to confusion amongst the general populace when a popular news story is based on preprints. But those caveats aside, I don't think those are enough to say, oh, we should stop preprints. I'm just saying those are the things that we have to be aware of.
For sure. Another question, student was wondering about the interviewing process. How did you prepare for it? Like, as a postdoc, you were looking for jobs. How did you know this is something that you wanted to do, and how did you prepare yourself for this search?
So, well, take a step back and sort of talk about my sort of career trajectory. When I was a PhD student, I thought I was going to stay in academia, and that was my goal. But as I got towards the end of my PhD, I was realistic enough to say, okay, look, if you are going to stay in academia and be a PI, run a lab, you have to be 110% invested in wanting to spend the rest of your career writing grants and convincing other people to work on stuff that you think is cool. But it's also really hard to find faculty positions. The number of faculty positions that are available right now is much, much less than the number of PhDs that are coming out of institutes, and the number of postdocs that are finishing at other institutes. So it's very competitive, and so you really have to be driven to want to do that. So I said, okay, look, when you get to the end of your postdoc, if you're not 100% driven to do that, don't waste your time trying to find a position, because it's going to waste the time for you, it's going to waste time for other people, and you're going to make yourself miserable. So as I got towards the end of my postdoc, as much as I loved working at the bench and doing experiments and thinking about directions my research would take, I decided that I was not 100% invested in that. So I started looking at other options. And I talked to people who had left academia, and they all told me, oh, cast a wide net because it's sometimes hard to find positions, look for a lot of different things. And so I was looking at things like consulting, and I was looking at grant administrator positions, at like small foundations. And editing was one thing that I was also thinking about. But the thing about editing positions is they are finite, and so you can only get one when there's one available, right? So you have to sort of keep your eyes open. And I just happened to be sort of looking for positions right at the time that Nature Neuroscience happened to be looking for an editor, with basically my background. And so it was sort of fortuitous that I happened to be looking at the time that they were looking. I sent in, my application. To say how I prepared for it, I don't know that I really did anything unusual. I just sort of I knew I would be interviewing for Nature Neuroscience, so I went and looked through last 6 months of issues, let's say, and just read through a bunch of papers and just sort of got an idea of the types of things that they were publishing at that time. I mean, I kind of already knew since I was in neuroscience, and that's a journal that I would read routinely, but I would just sort of look at some of the papers that I hadn't read and just sort of kind of get an idea for the broad scope of types of things that they were publishing. But the interview itself is a bit of something you'd be comfortable with, in the sense that you come in and you'll just talk to people on the team, you'll talk to the chief editor, they might have you talk to other people at the publisher, just sort of, they ask you questions, you ask questions. And then there's what I mentioned previously in one of the slides, that trial by fire, where they'll sort of assess your ability to evaluate papers relatively quickly. And so, for example, at Nature Neuroscience, when I was there, they gave me 3 papers, 3 very different neuroscience manuscripts that ranged from cellular molecular to systems neuroscience to cognitive functional imaging paper. And I had only 1 hour to read all 3 of them. And then, after the end of that hour, they came in and we went through the papers in their entirety, basically figure by figure. It was it took hours to go through all this, and evaluate whether or not I thought it was appropriate for for Nature Neuroscience. Would I send it out to review? If I was going to send it out to review, who would I ask to review it? Things like that. And again, you'll never ever ever have to read 3 papers in an hour again in your life, but it's sort of a stress test. And most journals that hire professional editors will do it either like that or very similarly like that.
Oh, 3 papers in an hour. Um, a student wanted to know, or I'm assuming they're a student, they could be a postdoc. What do you, your actual job itself, what do you think the most creative parts of your job are? Like, what do you find most enjoyable about it?
There's a lot. I mean, that's it. It depends on what your own particular interests are. For me, I've always enjoyed, reading new science. If you don't like reading papers, definitely not a job for you. So I really enjoy reading new papers and sort of seeing the cool new stuff that could potentially be coming out, even if it's not right for the journal. Just seeing something that is, that very few people other than the lab itself has seen, and thinking about those questions. So for me, it's really fun to think about that. And, you don't get to, when you're a researcher and you're thinking about a scientific problem, you get to think about, oh, I would do this experiment, that experiment, what have you. And so you don't really get to do too much of that anymore, but you do it a little bit, because in a sense you get to, if you're sending a paper out for review and you're getting review reports and you're getting ideas from what they think they could pursue it, you can think about ways that the authors might do that, or reasons why they can't pursue that. There might be technical reasons. And so there's still some of that sort of scientific thinking that goes into it as well, which I particularly find enjoyable. I also, like to think about some of the collections and things that we do, putting together papers that, of a particular theme together. It's like going through and looking through stuff that we've published and say, oh, this was a really cool paper in this area, and here's another really cool paper we published, and and here's the seminal paper from 1968 that would be cool for some junior trainees to see again. Being able to look at the big picture is really kind of cool. And think about topics in that sense. It's different and it's cool. I still enjoy going to meetings, and it's a little bit different when you're an editor compared to when you're a student postdoc, because you really, most of the time, you're not presenting when you go there, you're just taking stuff in. And so that's kind of cool, because you can sort of look at the big picture of a field. You don't have to focus just on the one little area that you're working on. You get to talk to people. And for good or ill, it's true that some of the more senior PIs who don't like to sort of, network with everybody there are more willing to talk to you as an editor, because they know that some way down the road they might want something from you. I hate to say it that way, but unfortunately that does happen. When I was a postdoc, I was at Columbia University, and we had joint lab meetings with this other lab, and I won't say who it was. The person was relatively well known in our field. And so he always knew who I was, but he never cared who I was until he found out I was going to Nature Neuroscience. And he's like, oh yeah, send me your contact information. So there's a little bit of that, but I won't say that's necessarily a good part of the job, but it's good to be able to talk to lots of people in the field. Because when I go to meetings, I make an effort to try to talk to both the senior people and the junior people. I try to make time to talk to graduate students and postdocs as well, and just see, those are going to be the future PIs, right? And so I kind of want to see what they're working on and what they're thinking, what they're going to be doing. So I find that kind of fun.
Okay. And I think one final question, just we're out of time, but student wants to know, you mentioned earlier about further career options for journal editors. Why do people typically move on? Do they see it more as temporary? Are they using it as a stepping stone to move to, say, something like the NIH, or does it have to do with like salary, change of pace?
Yes. So it can vary from person to person. But one thing I will say is the general trajectory at most journals is you'll start out as an assistant editor, and you go to something like an associate editor, or they might just call you editor depending on the journal, and then you go to senior editor. And then the problem there is the next step up would generally be executive editor or chief editor, depending on what that journal calls it. And that position, there's only one of those positions, right? And that position will only open up when someone leaves that position. So sometimes you can hit what I call the senior editor plateau. And some people just feel like, okay, I've been doing this long enough, I want to do something different. Also, some editors do burn out. One of the things that you do really have to get used to as an editor is you are going to spend 85% of your time saying no, right? And that is not easy for everybody, especially since if you're working for a high-profile journal like a Nature or a Cell, right? Your decisions, unfortunately, can make or break careers sometimes. Because so many institutes judge where you publish as a proxy for the quality of what you publish, which is so wrong, but unfortunately, the environment we live in right now, a rejected Nature paper could make or break a career, and so there is a lot of stress that does go along with that, and so some people do burn out. Sometimes it's just the ability to do something new, and maybe you're getting a better salary. Editorial positions pay reasonably well when you get into them, in the sense like if you're coming out of a student or postdoc, an editor salary is a huge step up, and you're like, wow, this is great. But it's not as much as you could make, let's say, in pharma, if you moved up in pharma and things like that. And sometimes journals, other journals, or other jobs, if they really want you, they'll make an offer to up your salary. To some degree, that's sort of one of the reasons I moved from Nature Neuroscience to JCB. Was at the time they were looking for a deputy editor, and that gave me an opportunity to have a more managerial role as well. Plus, they were offering me substantially more money, and so then I ended up moving over there, and then moving up to executive editor. And so, in that case, it wasn't entirely money, but the money definitely helped.
For sure. All right, I think that's all the questions that we have. I want everyone to join me in thanking Dr. Spenser for taking the time to talk with us all today. I hope everyone learned something. I learned a lot from this. If you guys came in late, there will be a recording in the near future posted on our website. Take a look at our recent blog post at ctaiog.com, and keep reading papers. If you guys aren't on Twitter, doing your nightly, Twitter scrolls for recent publications, I think that's a great way to do it. I've discovered so much there. And JCP does have a Twitter page, so definitely follow them.
Great.
So thank you again, Dr. Spenser, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You as well.